In today's video, I'm sharing with you the 4 most common post-processing or editing mistakes in landscape astrophotography, and we're going right now. I want to say right up front, I don't think I'm better than anybody at this. These are 4, maybe 5 mistakes that I've identified in my own work first, and once I was able to identify them and move past them was when I began to see progression and movement ahead in my own astrophotography. And so I hope something resonates for you and helps move your astrophotography forward. So without further ado, let's get going. The first mistake, and we're going to jump off right into the most controversial one, is color. Now before you switch off, I'm not advocating either for scientific accuracy or for artistic liberty. My goal when I post-process my images is sound post-processing practices that wouldn't be applied during daylight as well. I do try to edit my photos, my night photos, into something that is very scientifically accurate. I don't typically go more towards the blue or magentas. I do try and maintain some scientific realism in my night sky imagery. That said, I don't fault anybody for trying to go more blue or magenta or anything like that, just because our eyes are never going to perceive the night sky the same way that our camera sees it. Our rods cells in our eyes are much more active at night, and there are way more of them than our cone cells which see color. So when our color deprived rod cells are more active when it's dark outside, we see the Milky Way, we see the night sky in more of a black and white. If you're in a really dark sky and you're really real dark adapted, you will see some of those pastel colors. And if you look at Antares or brighter stars, you will see the different colors of the night sky. You do know that Antares is orange when you look at it. And so when you post-process your images, you can find some basis for some scientific accuracy in the colors of the night sky, just based on what you kind of can visualize. But there is obviously room for artistic liberty, because we can't really see everything in the night sky the way that our camera sees it. We are free to kind of do whatever we want to with our night sky images. There's a bit of a rabbit hole I've gone down, and I apologize for that. My point is, I'm not advocating either for scientific accuracy or blue sky or artistic liberty. My goal when I post-process is just sound post-processing practices. So what I want to do is remove color cast from my images. I don't want a kind of, if I shoot daylight white balance all the time, every time, I don't want that orange hue from a Bortle class 3 or 4 in my photograph. I want to neutralize that. I want to bring that cast out, which is going to really help my viewers' experience. It's going to make it more enjoyable. It's going to make it more truthful. It's going to make it more powerful. And I'm going to be able to focus their attention on what I want them to see in the night sky. And the same goes with if I edit really blue. That color cast in the image is going to be a distracting element for them. They're not going to be able to see the thing that I want them to see because they're too focused on the color cast of your image. So how do I find color cast in images and how do I correct it? Let's jump into Lightroom and Photoshop to find out right now. Now, if you're in Lightroom, it's a couple easy, quick steps to neutralize color casting images. So if you look at your histogram right here, you can see the red channel is quite a bit further ahead than anything else, and you can even see that in the image itself. You have that kind of brown, coppery, kind of orangey color washing over the entire image. So this color cast needs to be neutralized for this image to actually look really nice. There's really, if I go ahead and proceed with this, it's going to be distracting to the viewer. So if I go down here to vibrancy and saturation, I'm going to really pronounce those colors more so I can really see what I'm working with. So I have a lot of reds and oranges in here. So what I want to do is move my sliders around to neutralize the colors in the image. So I'm bringing the blues in until I start seeing some blue in here. Bring in some green, so loosen the magenta. And somewhere around there, I'm getting a nice balance of kind of blue tones, oranges. There's some magentas and greens in here. So kind of around here would be pretty close to a neutral kind of color balance. So I've more or less removed the cast from that image. If I turn this off, you can see our histogram looks much better. Those colors have moved together. The red channel is in front, which is good. In your night photography, you do want that red channel in front because a lot of this nebulosity is in that red range. So we do want that red channel a little bit in front, but the way it was too far. So this color cast has been neutralized in Lightroom. In Photoshop, this is done a bit of a different way. So we have the same image, we've loaded it into Photoshop, and I'm going to add a new layer on top. I'm going to hit Shift Delete, 50% gray, okay, and I'm going to change my blend mode to luminosity, add a hue saturation layer, move my saturation to 100. Now I can really see the colors in the image. And so I'm going to go back to my sky layer, and I'm going to add a color balance adjustment layer on top. And I'm just going to move my colors around until I get something a bit more neutral, where I'm introducing a few different colors into the image. All the way blue if you want to do that as well. Even somewhere like here might be closer, we can remove some more of that red. So that might be more accurate. Turn this off. So we can do a bit more. And even just doing that, we can see some of that nebulosity is starting to come out in this photograph. So that's how you negate color cast in Lightroom and Photoshop. Point number two, kind of a 2-for-1 type deal. You get 2 points from this one. It has to do with looking at your histogram. What a healthy histogram looks like and what a sick histogram looks like. So a histogram will show you where the data points fall along in your image. So kind of different luminance values, different color values of your image, all fit somewhere on that histogram. And a bad histogram is one that has too much information to the far left and too much information to the far right. So in this case, you're seeing crushed blacks or crushed dark midtones. There's too much contrast there, and also too much whites. And so your stars are too bloated, they're too bright. So you see those two problems happen quite often in landscape astrophotography: crushed blacks, bright stars. And so this usually occurs because of too much contrast adjustments globally. And so you see that in Lightroom, and you slide that contrast slider all the way up. You can see it when you jump a big S curve into the tone curve in Lightroom as well. This indiscriminates and just kind of adds contrast globally to your image. So what I'm advocating for instead of global contrast is focusing on mid-tone contrast. So it's focus on stretching out the middle of that curve without pushing data to the far right or the far left. So avoiding your blacks and your whites, but focusing instead on the mid-tones. And there's a couple ways to do this in Lightroom and Photoshop. Before we jump into how to do it, I want to show you what a bad histogram and a good histogram looks like. So let's look at it right now. This photograph here, if I load up a histogram, you can see it stretches from kind of the dark midtones to the light midtones, and there's actually no real information in the bright whites or the dark darks of the scene. Everything is lying in that midtone range. We've got a ton of contrast spikes in here that are kind of where all these nebulosity things are really showing up. So you can see the power of midtone contrast here in this image. If I look at this photograph, kind of a wider field of view, and I bring up a histogram of this, you can see it's a bit darker, but there's no information hugging that left edge. Everything is kind of moving to the right, and then I have a bunch of mid-tone contrast as it moves towards the right. And I have nothing that's really blown out in this scene. So this is, again, a picture of a healthy histogram with lots of mid-tone contrast. There's no dark darks and no bright whites. Now I'm going to look at a couple photos that leave a lot to be desired. So here's a photo that I was very, very proud of a couple of years ago. It showed a lot of, what I thought was really beautiful detail in the night sky. The difference in the histogram, if I update this, you can see a lot of that data is pushing to the far left. I have a lot of clipped blacks. All these blacks here are crushed. There's no data there. I should have moved it forward so that there was more mid-tone contrast, and dark mid-tones were I've lost those. If I look in the bright whites, a lot of those stars are completely blown out. That's why they're huge. So it looks very crunchy. It's a very kind of contrasty image. And there's no real mid-tone contrast. If I bring up this one, you can see all the different spikes happening in the mid-tone contrast region. If I look here, it's a simple swoop and then down. There's no mid-tone contrast. It's simply a picture of dark darks and bright whites. So how do I add mid-tone contrast in Lightroom and Photoshop? First thing, in Lightroom, you need to look at your histogram. So if I hold my mouse over the histogram, you can see these areas are highlighting. The midtones are going to fall from here to here. And so we want to avoid pushing anything in the whites and the blacks too far to the left or the right. So typically, what I used to do anyways to add contrast is decrease my blacks and punch my whites. And you can see what that does. It does increase the contrast in the image, but all I've done is move my outer edges further right or further left. So a different approach would be to move my exposure, shadow, and highlights around. So what I would suggest is dropping my shadows down, moving up my exposure, maybe dumping my highlights a bit lower, dropping this. And so this is a good start. And if I were to go into my tone curve, again, I can add some contrast here. And now I need to be careful with this. that I'm not going too far. So you see we blocked the blacks in place so they can't go any further down. And I want to maintain the highlights in the image, so I'm going to roll this back down. So that's down to nothing. So all I'm affecting here is adding contrast to the lower end of the midtones, and I'm moving up contrast on that upper part of this tone curve. Now in Photoshop this is done a bit differently. So first things first, I do recommend that you pick up or you build your own luminosity masks because you can target those midtones. So this is midtone adjustments, light midtones, dark midtones. You can target the midtones very specifically, and you can make contrast adjustments specifically to lighter midtones, dark midtones, and your midtones. And so you don't even have to touch your lights and your darks if you have a luminosity mask panel. So I really suggest using one of these for night photography. I know it's a landscape photography type thing, but I use it almost exclusively in my workflow these days. And so if you don't have a luminosity panel, there is a couple ways you can add contrast, midtone contrast to your image without degrading the dark blacks and the dark whites. And so, dark blacks and bright whites. So the first thing is grab a curve adjustment layer and adding an S curve to your photo, just like we did in Lightroom. And so again, we're not doing something major like this. Okay, we're just doing a very, very gentle S curve. We're going to roll these highlights back down so we can maintain those. Once we've done that, we can go in here and add another curve adjustment, and we can add a curve stretch and stretch this upwards. So we bring more midtones into the image. And we can do this several times until we start seeing some of that detail pop out. So little curve stretches, little contrast adjustments. Okay, we've got some gross banding happening, but once I add a fresh layer on top, the banding is going to go away, and you can see we've added quite a bit of contrast to our image just by stretching it out and adding little contrast adjustments. And finally, what separates good landscape astrophotography from great landscape astrophotography is a good star size reduction technique. And now I've got a video I've already made on that topic. It's about 10-12 minutes, kind of somewhere in there. I'm going to link it here and in the description. You can check that out when you have time, but it really sets apart an image. So if you look at this photograph, the stars are huge and they kind of take over the image. When you compare it to this one, all that's really left is nebulosity. There are stars, obviously, in the image. If I zoom in, you can see there are a lot of stars in the image. And if I zoom in here, there are a lot of stars in the image. But the difference is these stars are smaller than these ones, and they're less distracting. So I do recommend a good star size reduction to really push your astrophotography to the next level. Number 3, shout no and run away from the saturation slider. If I was CEO of Adobe for just one day and I could do one thing, it would be to push out an update globally to every Lightroom and Photoshop user, removing saturation from everybody's platforms. Why it exists is beyond me, especially when you have a tool that's way better right above it called vibrancy. And if anyone that doesn't know the difference between saturation and vibrancy, saturation is adding saturation to every single pixel in your image, regardless of whether it's saturated or not. Vibrancy is going to target just those muted tones that aren't as saturated and bring those saturation back into them without targeting those pixels that already are saturated. So it's a much more targeted adjustment where it's focused on bringing life and vibrancy into those tones that need it. Saturation is more of a dumb tool that adds saturation to every single pixel, and so you can see it won't take very long in the saturation slider to start clipping colors and really shifting them too far to one side. Now, I'm not saying we don't add color into our night sky images. Anybody with a raw file of the night sky knows it needs color and saturation in the photograph, but there are ways to do it that aren't going to destroy your image like a saturation slider will. So avoid the saturation slider at all costs and focus instead on using a couple of tools in Lightroom and Photoshop that will really help enhance the color of your night sky without pushing stuff too far. So let's jump in right now and take a look at a couple of these examples. In Lightroom, we've got this photo that we've kind of been working on, and so first thing I want to do is bring some vibrancy back in. I'm going to bring it up to about 10 or so, and I'm going to go in here and actually work on my HSL. So what I want to do is grab this little target here, and I can target different tones in the image. So if I want to move my oranges up, I can just click and drag. Now obviously this is the first stage in color work if you're in Lightroom, that kind of thing. So we don't necessarily want to do a whole bunch right now, but that's kind of the tools that I will use. If I'm in Photoshop, I can target specific colors using powerful tools like color range. So I go to select color range. I can pick a color. So if I want to enhance this color, looks like I got an update. So if I want to enhance the orange in the row Fichi complex or the blues, that kind of thing, I can really kind of shift this down. So I'm targeting just those tones. If I go OK, now it's made that selection. I can go into whatever, a selective color if I want to. One thing I'm going to want to do though is I'll click on this and I want to feather this mask a little bit. I can even go select and mask here and shift my edge out a bit so that I make it a bit bigger of a selection. I can go a bit narrower. Okay, so there are a lot of tools you can use to target specific tones in your image, and then going in here and simply shifting, you know, different colors and whatever you want to do in here. So say we want blues, I can go in here and, you know, if I want to, I'll click, I can go ahead and erase the adjustment from areas that I don't want that to happen in. So from all over here, I just want to include it just in that star that is blue, right? So things like that. So specific color tone adjustments, obviously that's too extreme, and I could actually go in here and shift the white so make it a bit brighter, right? So there are a lot of different ways you can target specific color tones in here. Another way, obviously, you can use hue saturation. If I want to click on here, I can shift my yellows. I can add saturation to just my yellows. Cool them down, that kind of thing. So I can move stuff around and target specific colors. One of the biggest takeaways I can give you in this point is to wait until your mid-tone contrast work is done. It makes no sense to do color work if you haven't effectively removed that light pollution and your image is just simply one color. If you're targeting specific color tones and everything is orange or red or blue or whatever, you want to make sure that you've negated that color cast in your image by using mid-tone contrast, pulling light pollution out, that kind of thing, using curves, in order to really effectively target those tones that you want to target. So work on your mid-tone contrast first, ensure that you have a lot of nebulosity and detail in the night sky, and then work on enhancing those colors. Number 4, and in case you haven't heard it yet, liberal use of sliders is the quickest way to destroy your image. And the same kind of goes for the Clarity and DEHAZE tool. Clarity is a targeted mid-tone adjustment contrast tool that Lightroom has implemented. Now it targets the midtones and it pushes them out, but it doesn't push out the far right and far left. So you may think, hey, this is exactly what he said we should do. So now there's a slider that does this for us, which is true. It does help your mid-tone contrast, but it's doing it non-selectively. It's doing it just grabbing the middle and pushing it outwards. It doesn't care what ranges that you really want to focus on. And so while this tool is maybe helpful, you can add a little bit of it. Too much is going to push things too far. Now, DEHAZE is something that I use a lot, very, very frequently early on. It was like magic. You slide that slider all the way up and all of a sudden light pollution disappeared. You had nebulosity just start popping. Stars got nice and bright. You had this nice contrast and the darker parts of the core started really lifting out. And you had this really incredible, it just magically appeared, this photograph. It looked good from 10 feet away until you really look closer. And you see that those stars, they started getting bloated and they're blown out. The blacks got too dark. The contrast was too much. And where that light pollution was, there's just noise and artifacts. And it really wasn't a very pretty way of doing things. So again, there are ways that we can add mid-tone contrast without using the DEHAZE slider. And we've already seen a couple of examples of that as well. So I'm not going to get too far into that. But in terms of removing light pollution, there are better ways of doing this in both Lightroom and Photoshop, and we're going to jump into that right now. One way that I use to do it is to grab a gradient tool right here. I can drag it up to roughly where that gradient is happening, and I can essentially just move this, shift this color balance so it works. Now, what I would do actually before that is to move my vibrancy and saturation up to 100% so I can see what I'm doing again. I've got too much of this going on. So I open this back up. I want to feather this out a bit more. I need more blues in here, a bit more greens. I can even bring another one in here. Okay, so something like that would be nice. Now we've got two magentas, so I might even pull some this back in. Green out. So this would be how I would do this in Lightroom. And so if I negate this back to 0, we remove the light pollution coming in more or less from this image, or at least the color cast from that light pollution. In Photoshop, this is done using a curves adjustment. And so here we see we do have light pollution coming into the bottom. If I zoom out, we can see that more clearly. And so what I'm going to do is simply grab a curve adjustment layer. I'm going to drag this down a bit so I can darken that light pollution down. Grab my color channel in here. So red, if I bring some red out, moving it up here, pulling some green out as well, until I get a nice kind of neutral color. So once I have this neutralized, I can hit Command I and invert that, and I can simply grab my gradient tool, make sure I'm on low, and just on white, pull this adjustment into my photograph so I'm removing that color balance. Okay, so something like that. You can see we've pulled that light pollution more or less out of the image in the bottom. So, well guys, that's it. That's the 4 or 5 common mistakes that I've seen in my own work and work that others have thrown at me to critique and review. So I hope you found maybe 1 or 2 of these helpful and you've added them to your own workflow in order to kind of help progress your astrophotography. If that's the case for you, appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more. And until the next one, guys, thank you so much for watching. Cheers.